All right, welcome back. We're now going to be hearing from Professor Larry Solomon of Georgetown about the constraint principle, and our commentator will be Professor Dick Fallon from Harvard. Professor Solomon?
Solom, thank you. Thanks once again to the organizers of the Originalism Works in Progress Conference. It's really, truly one of the highlights of my year every year. And I think this year's papers are especially rich and interesting, and it really is a privilege to be here. I want to just extend a special note of thanks to Dick Fallon for agreeing to comment. Dick Fallon was my professor at Harvard Law School in federal courts. I believe this was Dick's first year of teaching, as I recall.
Larry knew more than I did about a number of topics, which made it terrifying.
And Dick was really a model of precise legal thinking and had a profound influence on the way I teach and also on the way that I think about the law. So it's just a special privilege to engage with him here. This is a true work in progress. I would say that the text is about 2/3 complete. I don't know what law review will ever accept this thing, because I think it will be about 60,000 words. And I would say it's slightly over the half-baked mark. Lots of things are still being worked out. I certainly don't anticipate this paper being done before next February. That's my goal for completion of the paper. So comments are still welcome. It might look like this paper is more set in stone than it is. It's already been completely torn up once, and I am willing to completely tear it up again. Comments are especially helpful now. So the paper has two goals. The first is to formulate an ecumenical version of the constraint principle. Right, so the version of the constraint principle is intended to be ecumenical in the following sense. Different originalists have different ideas about constraint. And from the point of view of ecumenical originalism, for the point of view of trying to find agreement among originalist theories, constraint as consistency is offered as a so-called least common denominator, that is, the minimum version upon which originalists can agree, and therefore a dividing line between originalism and non-originalism. Of course, you can view that dividing line other ways. The paper simply stipulates that this is the dividing line between originalism and non-originalism, and brackets the question of linguistic negotiation over the meaning of these theory terms. Constraint is consistency, which is formulated in an elaborate way in the paper. The core idea is that the content of constitutional doctrine and the decision of constitutional cases and also similar actions by non-judicial actors must be consistent with the communicative content of the constitutional text. Mitch and I were just talking about this. We have been trying to understand each other for at least, I think, 3 years on this issue, and I think we finally got through to each other. It was one of those epiphany moments where finally I think I get it. And thank you, Mitch, for helping to clarify this aspect of the project. So the second aim of the paper is to bring clarity to debates over the constraint principle. And the paper attempts to do this in 4 ways. First, to carefully delineate the structure of argumentation about constitutional constraint in the context of originalism. The key move the paper makes here is to distinguish between pro tanto versus decisive reasons for observance of the constraint principle. I think frequently the debate is framed as if the burden is on originalists to offer decisive reasons, and the nature of this debate is such that it would be extremely unlikely that decisive reasons could be offered. Instead, the paper searches for pro tanto reasons, recognizing then that much of the real action in debates about whether or not original meaning should be constraining focuses actually on normative objections to originalism. I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about the canonical cases objection to illustrate that later. Second, the paper emphasizes the importance of pairwise comparisons, right? So I think that this is crucially important. There are many rivals to originalism, and they are very different from each other, right? So, for example, unconstrained Thayerianism, right, the idea that we should just let Congress do what it wants to do, and Congress should rule through statutes but should not be constrained by the Constitution, that's very different than common law constitutionalism. Those two theories have practically nothing in common at the normative level other than their rejection of originalism. And the only way to conduct this debate, this is very annoying if you're writing an article, is to do all the pairwise comparison. So there are not, and the paper identifies 9 families of approaches that are non-originalist with respect to constraint. And then this part of the paper is probably the least fleshed out. I tried to include some of the concerns with respect to each of the 9 alternatives, but that part of the paper will have to be blown up considerably because each of them deserves much more discussion than is there now. The third point about clarity in the debate is simply to try to do my best to identify what I think are the strongest pro tanto justifications, and the way the paper does this is to focus on 2 clusters of arguments, which I call the rule of law cluster and the legitimacy cluster, and then to identify different arguments that have been made. Some of these arguments are somewhat new to this paper, but most of these arguments are familiar, although they may be given a new configuration in the paper. Of course, I would appreciate feedback on what the strongest pro tanto justifications actually are. The fourth and final attempt to clarify is to examine the most important objections. And of course, there are many important objections, and they're not all even in the paper yet. But I think that it might be useful for me now, in the 2 minutes and 19 seconds that I have remaining, to discuss the canonical cases objection, which I just think is theoretically very interesting and has played an important role in arguments about originalism. So we all kind of know what the canonical cases objection does. It sort of goes like this: originalism, inconsistent with Brown, game over. So now there are various possibilities for reactions to this, right? But it's not really clear what the game over move means, right? And so it seems to me one of the most important things to do is to figure out what the nature of this objection is. Is the argument that originalism is not the law? That would be one possibility, right? That this is a move within law, and the argument is Brown's the law, therefore originalism is the law. Or is the argument that originalism will lead to bad outcomes in the future? Brown v. Board will somehow be reversed in the future because of originalism? Or is the argument that in a possible world in which originalism had been in place in 1954, Brown would have come out differently, and then that has either some normative significance or it tells us some other thing about originalism? Maybe that's the objection. Now, how do originalists react to this objection? Of course, one possibility, the McConnell possibility, is to argue that originalism is consistent with Brown. And I actually agree that there is a very strong case that it is, but in a way that's cheating, because surely there's some canonical case that originalism is inconsistent with, right? And what I would say is that in order to, I have 7 seconds left, it is not time yet, that in order to clarify the nature, now it's time, of this objection, we really need to understand what the objection is, and the paper attempts to do that. So thank you very much.